Welcome, everyone, to the History of Gardens and Landscape seminar at the Institute of Historical Research in London. I'm Michael Ann Mullen. I'm one of the seminar conveners. I'd like to remind you to mute your computer and turn off your videos now. You can turn the video back on again for the question and answer later on. And please write your questions in the chat box, and one of the conveners will relay it to the speaker. This is the second of the summer term seminars. It will be recorded and will be available on Zoom for a week. It'll also be available on the Institute's YouTube channel indefinitely. Links to both recordings will be sent to those on the mailing list. I think that's all the business. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Francesca Murray, who is a second-year PhD student at Queen Mary's College, University of London. She's going to talk to us about mutual aid and networks of 19th-century gardeners, of the 19th-century gardeners trade. Work on a book on the Rothschild's Exbury Gardens led her to an interest in looking at the Grand Gardens from the point of view of the gardeners. Obviously, her commission was from the point of view of the owners. Her earlier study of social history provided a good grounding for her studies in garden history with Tim Mole, and now, and for this work on her PhD at Queen Mary's. So we look forward to hearing your paper, Francesca, and I'll catch hold of you again at the end.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Can you just confirm that you can see that?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much. I think we're 6:03, so if people are coming in, we'll just go with that. Thank you very much to Michael Ann and Stephen and Pippa and everybody on the committee for holding this online session and letting me talk about my PhD subject, which I'm sort of in the depths of. So I'm here to talk about the networks and communities of the 19th century gardeners that joined certain associations and that led to the founding of a mutual aid association, the Gardeners Benevolent, in 1839. This is work in progress, but I will be trying to demonstrate how my research is revealing the lived experiences and connections of the gardeners that they had with each other and also within the trade. I'm interested in what structures were in place and without a modern day welfare state to provide for them. And how did this emerging trade look after their fellow gardeners in old age and infirmity? So two things to just briefly mention. What was a mutual aid association? It's in a basic form. It was a collective pot of money held as a form of credit to pay out when members of a community needed financial assistance or burial fees. And an indigent gardener is one that is needy or poor. So Britain is a nation of gardeners, and there is a suggestion that the aesthetics and action of gardening is an answer to society's well-being, health and longevity of life, particularly for the ageing population within the economic framework of the welfare state. And it is a pastoral pursuit. In past literature, the image of the gardener has suffered from being romanticized as a worthy and Arcadian trade. Still today in popular media, historic working gardeners and nurserymen are seen mostly in the context of gardening estates or parks or botanical introductions. As the rich paid for these to be created and their narratives endure, we know a lot about their whimsical gardening tastes, but with little reference to the lives of the working gardeners that actually made them. The origins of today's £24.2 billion British horticultural industry had to come from somewhere. And I would say that it came from this transformation in the 19th century of the practical craft of gardening into a professional trade, primarily led by those working gardeners in the metropolis. So what do 19th century gardeners all have in common? Well, they worked, they got old, and they died. The apron-clad, weather-faced gardeners who dug and planted and cultivated the rural estate gardens are seen in the context of deferential estate staff, lucky to have regular employment and the bothy roof over their head. Head gardeners who had trained under apprenticeship ruled the huge teams of gardeners, under gardeners, orchid specialists, kitchen gardeners, journeymen, labourers and garden boys. They dealt with the vast number of suppliers at the garden gate and sometimes inhabited the unique position of sage, down-to-earth garden confidant to the wealthy owner. Job security was indeed dependent on results, but also how deferential and useful you were to your employer, which obviously declined the older and more infirm you got. Estate accommodation was often limited in old age, as were private pensions gifted by employers at their whim. Similarly, around the metropolis, as a self-employed journeyman or domestic gardener, you had no presumed safety net, nor necessarily a sympathetic middle-class suburban employer who respectfully followed the Victorian guiding principles of self-help and thrift and expected their employees to follow their example. As an entrepreneurial nurseryman, grocer, fruiter, master gardener or florist, you had to ensure that you had enough children to work in and inherit the business to survive bankruptcy and destitution. To keep up with juggling the demand for garden plants and new introductions and gardening fashions, the realities of a life of an elderly or indigent gardener in the twilight of their careers had limited silver linings. So what did the gardeners have to navigate in the 19th century? I'll just briefly go through these: an environment of rapid economic expansion and social change, a poor law reform early on in the century, which created outdoor relief and workhouses as a destination to be avoided. A divide between rich and poor became an increasing concern of British society, and self-help and thrift was promoted as a respectable Victorian ideals. Fraternity and benevolence found itself in all professional sectors, and charitable fundraising saw significant growth. So financial probity and planning for old age or illness was a respectable individual and collective demonstration of fiscal self-discipline in the 19th century, but it wasn't easy. So where did gardeners find sources of association? And many of these you'll probably might recognize. This is the Worshipful Company of Gardeners, a well-known city guild, which sought to create association. This is, just got my very large one. This is their beautiful emblem: in the sweat of thy brows shall thou eat thy bread. And this sought to create association and regulate the garden trade in the City of London from 1605, but to a radius of about 6 miles, particularly the market gardens. But by the 19th century, it had actually gone into dormancy because the expansion of the metropolis and the proliferation of garden businesses around and about the metropolis created difficulties to control that marketplace. Freemasonry. Now here on the right-hand side, you can see a beautiful Freemasons emblem with the pruning knife. The benefits of the Freemasons' brotherly networks and mutual aid and its ritualized Masonic proceedings, based on the allegorical symbolism of the Garden of Eden, were highly attractive to the grocers, fruiterers, florists and nurserymen that traded in Covent Garden Market, close to the Freemasons' Hall. Gardeners can be a secretive lot, particularly about their latest plant varieties or compost recipe. And they certainly were Masons, particularly in Scotland, according to garden commentator J.C. Loudon. You can see here the pruning knife of the Adam Lodge. The Scottish Free Gardeners led to the Adams Lodge of London being founded in 1781 as a fraternity or community for improving the art of gardening, to establish a fund for the mutual support and relief of each other in the time of sickness, lameness or distress, as well as being a referee source for garden owners when recruiting a new gardener. Unfortunately, it dwindled away by 1827. There was a resurgence of interest in the late 19th century when the Horticultural Lodge was established in 1893. So benefit and friendly societies were another source of association, and they were an integral part of British working society by the 19th century, having evolved from informal methods of collective aid within parishes and local communities. The church custom of almsgiving and handouts from landowners was seen as being conditional. The local community had internal ways of dealing with the fluctuations of life's hardships, and the early box or benefit clubs existed in the form of a locked box, sometimes with 3 keys in the possession of different community leaders, into which people placed spare coins. These were distributed to those in the community in distress or to pay for burials. This was really important when the Medical Anatomy Act came into force in 1832, which allowed medical students to practice on available cadavers. So the Friendly Society's subscriptions went through the roof when that happened. They evolved to provide several of the needs we now recognise as being state functions, including social security and a very limited protection against the effects of industrial injury and burial fees. They had a level of individualism watched over by apparently disinterested representatives of society as trustees and directors. This seemed to work as it appeased government fears of collectivism and uprising, and the popularity of friendly societies increased over the century as they evolved into a powerful welfare force. By the middle of the 19th century, just to give you a statistic, there were over 32,000 friendly societies in Britain. So they were really, really popular. And you may have noticed that I haven't mentioned horticultural societies or botanical societies yet, but I only have 45 minutes. So I'm briefly going to mention them. And they were direct competitors to the florists, who I'm going to talk about in a minute. And they had the backing of the elite parent society, as you can see, this lovely Cruikshank cartoon of the Horticultural Society meeting with lots of strange things on the table, set up in 1804, and the history has been well documented. Many of you may know about it. It published transactions, organised shows and plant committees, and was populated by elite gentlemen botanists and nurserymen at the top of their game. In the progress of the science of horticulture, which inspired the cultivation of hundreds of new plants and varieties and cultivars, in the long run, they may well have endured the longest, so that the florist flowers became a mere fragment of that horticultural offer. But I'm about to suggest that it was the florists that looked after the working gardeners first. Now, this is George Glennie, and it's not a very good picture. This is actually the same picture that David Marsh uses on his blog, because there's not very many pictures of Mr. Glennie. And he looks rather avuncular and rather nice, but he was not really. He was quite a difficult man, but for good reason. The working metropolitan garden in the early 19th century, the activities of the florist societies were the primary source of association. The term florist was not a modern type of florist who deals with cut flowers in pots and sells them from a retail establishment. It evolved from the 17th century into one who grew only certain kinds of flowering plants, and these to a very high standard. The devil was in the detail of the petal formation, the colour, the size. It was a very exacting craft. And by the 19th century, these 8 florist flowers included the carnation, anemone, ranunculus, tulip, auricula, the pink, the polyanthus, and dahlia. And this gentleman, Mr. George Glennie, was the florist's main champion. He was a dahlia expert and he was an agitator. He liked to call himself the Gardeners O'Connell, because this was the time of the Chartists. And he was a son, actually, of a watch case maker from Clerkenwell and a rock garden writer. He published the first weekly gardening newspaper, the Gardeners Gazette, from his office in the Strand, and used this to champion the florists and his florist society, the Metropolitan Society of Florists and Amateurs. You can see here with their wonderful crest. They had the Queen Dowager as their patron, and he used his society to promote their cause. Medals were won at the society shows staged around London, especially, much to Glennie's pride, a full year before those of the Horticultural Society. Locations included the Egyptian Hall on Piccadilly for indoor shows and outdoor shows at Cremorne House Gardens in Chelsea, at Lord's Cricket Ground in 1836, close to Henderson's Nursery at Pineapple Place and the Royal Botanic Gardens at Regent's Park. The Bell and Anchor Tavern in Hammersmith, close to Leon Kennedy's nursery grounds, and the popular South of the Thames pleasure grounds, the Vauxhall Gardens and the Beulah Spa in South Norwood. In 1834, over 12,000 people attended the Metropolitan Society shows in honour of Queen Adelaide's birthday, its the patron, at the Surrey Zoological Gardens in Lambeth. Florists sought fellowship and trade at florist meetings, and the amateur gentlemen growers joined them in this fascination with floriculture. After a day's competition, a convivial dinner or feast was held, and like the Freemasons, the florists carried out rituals including singing often quite raucously, and gave toasts, and they dined with dessert, waiters, and a bottle of wine for 15 shillings. You can see on the right here, this is the South London Floricultural Society, and that was established in around 1836. It also had its shows at the Royal Zoological Gardens, and tastefully decorated marquees with floral banners overhead were erected alongside the caged Senegalese pygmy antelopes. Military bands played to entertain visitors. Members included local nurserymen and florists of Clapham, Battersea and Lambeth, many of whom would go on to support the Gardeners Benevolent. The sense of community that these meetings engendered brought the gardeners together as a distinct social group, which to a degree crossed class barriers within a polite social structure. Victorian manners allowed for practical gardeners to mix with amateur gentlemen garden owners over a common interest in plants. Although fierce competition for the best in show often obscured the community spirit, these meetings were a vital part of a trade professionalizing itself, establishing networks and creating social cohesion. So how did these brotherly ideals merge into the creation of a charitable organization for old and needy gardeners? So in 1839, Glennie chaired the annual dinner of horticulturalists at the Crown and Anchor Tavern nearby to his office to establish the Gardeners Benevolent Society. He had always wanted to establish a national body for gardeners and saw a mutual aid association as a vehicle to bring the gardening community together and for him to control the narrative rather than the Horticultural Society. He proposed the idea of a benefit society for gardeners that night. The resolution was supported by nurserymen and gardeners present, and the Gardeners Benevolent Society was born. In a simple form, the Gardeners Benevolent was a friendly society and later formally registered as such, where through a subscription and ballot system, it offered a small annual pension of £16 to those elderly and indigent gardeners in need. They have to have been a gardener for at least 30 years, be aged over 60, and afford the annual subscription of a guinea. Significantly, widows could also apply for a £12 pension. Gardeners' wages were so low, mostly head gardeners, seedsmen, florists and nurserymen could afford to regularly pay the subscription. And you can see the key nursery, the Metropolitan Nursery men that were involved. We've got Mr. Lowe of Clapton here, Mr. Groom of Walworth, Prothero, which will be Prothero Morris, the auctioneering company, Mr. Gaines of Battersea. I mean, the list is just Mr. Brown of Slough, Hopkins of Brentford. There's Glennie here of Wharton. He was living in Wharton Lodge at that point in Isleworth. Stewart of Salt Hill Slough, Chandler of Vauxhall, Catley of Chelsea. They are the top nurserymen of their day. And Mr. Mountjoy, as you can see, rather enjoyed the singing. He said, "Sir, I have observed that in your notice of the vocal gentleman at the Benevolent Society's dinner, you have invidiously omitted my name, although everyone present on that occasion can testify that I sung 2 or 3 songs much better than either Mr. Groom or Mr. Forrest, as both of these persons will, I hope, have the candour to acknowledge." I think he was enjoying himself. So candidates' credentials had to be provided with the references from leading influencers or employers happy not to have to cough up for the private pension themselves. So it was vitally important that any career highlights at the florists or horticultural shows didn't get missed. The first pension was given not to a London gardener, but here to John Standen. And this is the minute book of the Gardeners Benevolent Society, which is a fantastic document. John Standen, here he is, I've got my little arrow on him, resolved that John Standen be placed on the pension list in this institution, there being no competitors. Now, he actually came from Staining in Sussex, and you can see that Mrs. Mary Newbury, she wasn't satisfactory to the committee, so she couldn't be recommended to be eligible to become a pensioner. So the first pensioner sort of got it by default. He was obviously deserving enough. And the first widow pensioner, here she is, Sarah Ackley here, widow of William Ackley, and she's actually obviously had to move out of the house, and she's staying in a lodging house in Surrey. And William Attlee of Lambeth, his brother was Richard Attlee, who was previously the head gardener of the Beaufoys, who were a Quaker family of vinegar distillers in Lambeth. And he had actually set up a successful business in Oval after being a head gardener there. So, and he had also to be on the Gardeners Benevolent Committee. So he was obviously a mover and shaker and helped get his sister-in-law a pension. At a meeting of the West London Gardeners Association for Mutual Instruction in 1841, Mr. Douglas, the retired head gardener of the Conservative MP, Mr. J. Barnaby for East Worcestershire, gave a rousing speech about the new institution. He said, "The name of such an institution ought to sound like music in every gardener's ears." He recognised that some gardeners had been affluent through the success of their trade. However, he warned that this could be a temporary state of affairs. He said, "Picture to yourself a gardener who has been respectable until overtaken by disappointment and misfortune, and had wielded for nearly half a century his hammer and his knife under many a bleak wall, until his hair was blanched by wind and time, and his legs by debility, refused to scale the ladder or his hand to grasp a knife any more. How comfortable would it be for such a man to sit down on his chair and say to himself, 'I have been a contributor to the Gardeners Benevolent Institution.'" And of course, this desire applied to his better half, to her who has been the comfort of his life and the solace of his declining days, and perhaps whose welfare is more dear to him than his own. Biennial elections were held with an ever-increasing list of candidates. The urgent need for respectable funding meant Glennie's association with the society was short-lived. As the disruptor, he was deemed way too disruptive. The officers of the charity were practical gardeners, but representatives of the gardening elite and the Horticultural Society's influence appeared. Chiswick trained Joseph Paxton, Chatsworth's famous head gardener, and John Linley. Here he is, the editor of the Gardeners Chronicle, and they soon took control of its promotion. The support of the newly established Gardeners Chronicle, which saw itself as the mouthpiece of the gardening trade, was hugely important to the Gardeners Benevolent, as its election lists, its appeals for candidates, annual dinner reports, election results were all published in its pages for the gardening trade and the amateur gardening public to see. Using these, supported by census data, historic property archives, and any mention in contemporaneous garden literature, we can start to build a picture of the working lives of the pensioners and garner really interesting insights into their community. We learn about the rheumatism, life-limiting asthma, paralysis, the broken arms from falling out of pear trees. Chiswick gardener Francis Chamberlain suffered a severe accident involving the flap of a stable block, depriving him of the use of a hand. Henry Bridden of West Kirby, a gardener all his life, walked out of a greenhouse, was stung in the eye by a bee, and rendered totally blind. Although this all appears gloomy, we also start to learn of the interconnectedness of these gardeners, their relationships, the regionality, the groupings which suggest rural and urban networks, the benevolent patrons and the trickier employers. We can see who they worked with and where they moved to in their career or stayed put all their lives. Their families and dynastic legacies, gardeners' children often became gardeners, old gardeners often found fellowship lodging with younger gardeners or nephews and nieces. So picking up where the Worshipful Company of Gardeners had left off, and with respectable involvement of the Horticultural Society officers, the City of London network of bankers, merchants and philanthropists became its altruistic backers and investors of its funds. The annual festival dinner of the Gardeners Benevolent was held in the city, and for example, the after-dinner speech by one Charles Dickens in 1852 provided a suitable guilt-inducing funding boost. The list of dinner presidents reads like a catalogue of the great and worthy. And the list of donations and their donors' names were carefully published for every gardener to see the benevolence of their masters. However, what I'm interested in are the 500 or so pensioners and their lives and networks and experiences. And these gardeners are emerging as fascinating and resourceful people. So this is William Wells. And on the left, we can see he is a candidate here for a pension in 1843. Mr. Chaundy, a nurseryman, is actually correcting the age that has been published in the previous advert, and he solicits the votes of subscribers for Wells. There cannot be a case more deserving, as for one of the 2 pensions out of the 4 candidates. And the 4 candidates you can see here, they're numbered, they are where they live, their age, and also 2 of them are applying for the 2nd time. The middle cutting here shows that indeed William did obtain the most votes, and he publishes below that result a grovelling thank you to his supporters. He has, through their kindness, been successful and tenders them his most sincere and grateful thanks for their favours. However, by December that year, he is negotiating a place at an almshouse in Dalston and is seeing whether the committee of the Gardeners Benevolent will allow this benefit alongside his pension. William Wells requests the sanction of the committee to his canvassing for the benefit of the Metropolitan Benefit Society's asylum, which consisted of a small house to live in with coals and candles, but no money. He requests to have a place there, and this is the Metropolitan Benefit Society's asylum. And this is where he's aiming for. And you can see how resourceful Mr. Wells is, and it looks like he managed to get the committee's agreement to apply. The Gardeners Benevolent had problems attracting regular subscribers from the trade and not just relying on charitable donations and festival dinners, and there were a few reasons why. Firstly, it was deemed too expensive and to be a benefit only to the estate head gardeners, foremen and successful nurseries, rather than perhaps the everyday gardener, whose income was not regular or large. Secondly, the elections were perceived to be rigged and easily engineered to benefit the popular candidates who were promoted with adverts and soft pressure within the community. To attract more subscriptions and end the endless debate in the gardening press about those who hadn't subscribed for a length of time unfairly getting a pension, the Society changed its rules in 1860 to ensure its longer subscribers of over 15 years were automatically allocated a pension without election. And this is the poster boy of the Gardeners Benevolent, Mr. James Wells. He had worked as a head gardener around the Chichester area since the age of 14, including for Lord Keane at Christchurch. In 1860, aged 72, he was allocated a pension without election and was a pensioner for 31 years in total, which was unusual, as many died the year of their election or a few years later. He'd actually died in 1891, aged 103, and he had seen the reign of 3 kings and 1 queen. So 2 of his 3 sons were gardeners, and this is James's daughter. This is James's daughter, Sarah Ann Wells, who married a fielder. Now, her son, so James's grandson, Charles Fielder, was a head gardener, and here he is. He's sitting in this cricket club, his cricket team, and he is also, that's the North Mims Estate cricket team, and he was head gardener there. He also was awarded the VMH and you can see in 1911, here he is with such amazing luminaries like George Forrest, Engelhart, Bean, Boscawen, Bowles. He really had hit the heights of gardening, and this is his medal here. And this is a book that he was given. His family have many books that are part of his estate. So as Sarah Houghton, James's great-great-great-granddaughter, very kindly shared this information with me. And so what it shows is that the gardening certainly can be defined as a dynastic trade, where families devoted themselves to the craft and handed down skills and techniques through the generations. And they also handed down their devotion to the Gardeners Benevolent. And just to give a contrast to James was very lucky. He was, this picture comes from a book about a pamphlet about the Benevolent Society. Edward Marshall was another gardener who, in contrast, I'll just tell you a contrasting case. He was born on the Alnwick estate of the Duke of Northumberland, and the Duke of Northumberland was the patron of the Gardeners Benevolent. So you'd expect him to be very interested and also interested in his gardeners. He actually had to apply for a pension 13 times. And finally, after the 13th time, he got a pension in 1854, but he died 2 years later. So he wasn't so lucky. What about the widows? Well, Elizabeth Ayres, I haven't got a picture of her, and I think she'd probably be looking quite grumpy and quite frustrated, because I'm going to tell you about her situation. She was the wife of William Port Ayres, and William Port Ayres had an excellent pedigree. He was the son of Robert Ayres, the well-respected head gardener of Shipley Hall in Derbyshire. He was educated at the Horticultural Society Gardens at Chiswick, and he was destined for greatness. He was employed as a gardener to James Cook of Blackheath and exhibited skills at hardwood propagation and the improvement of pelargoniums. He became a nurseryman and florist in Blackheath, renting some space from his employer. However, the business did not succeed, and he was declared bankrupt in 1853 and returned to jobbing gardening. He was a regular contributor to the letters pages of the Gardeners Chronicle, and also co-edited the short-lived Gardeners magazine of botany with Thomas Moore, the curator of the Chelsea Physic Garden, and he published The Cultivation of the Cucumber, an interesting tome. So he was prolific, but he was declared bankrupt again in 1853 in the Liverpool courts. He moved to Nottingham with his wife and 5 children and became the gardening correspondent for the Nottingham Guardian. He invented, and you can see it here on the left, his patented imperishable hothouse. There's a lovely section of it with some lovely plants in it. And he set up a factory. So he patented it in 1870, and he set up a factory to manufacture it in Newark, and also one in New Cross in London. He returned to the leafy suburb of Forest Hill with his family, but his health failed after all this Victorian enterprise, and he suffered a long illness, dying in 1875 with, and as you can see, this is his probate, effects under £100 to his name, and this is his bankruptcy list. So no wonder Elizabeth was a bit frustrated. So after about 2 years, she appears on the candidate list for the Gardeners Benevolent in 1877, but she doesn't have a voice because she's a woman. So her mother-in-law, Sarah Ayres, had received a Gardeners Benevolent pension in 1859, but Elizabeth and her 5 children needed to rely on representatives from the trade to appeal for assistance, and she pulls out all the stops to get respectable support. So she's got a local solicitor, Mr. William Newton of Hillside, Newark. He put his name as a referee. She's got John Wills of Onslow Crescent. Now, he was a floral decorator and a nurseryman. He had a nursery in Fulham, and he was known for the suggestion of putting the Albert Memorial in glass to protect it from the city smog, but he advocates for her. He had already proposed to raise a subscription for the benefit of the family, who he said were left totally unprovided for by William. And the top prize of this, and you can see him here, is the Reverend Canon Samuel Reynolds Hole, the famous Rosarian and horticulturalist, and he adds his name. He is obviously a Nottingham resident, and he had actually managed to lobby for a Gardener's Benevolent pension for his own aged head gardener, Evan Hurst, in 1867. And he delivered this after dinner speech at the annual festival dinner in 1872. So he was no stranger to the society, and it was definitely a matter of who you knew. And she got a pension. So as the century progressed, the trade expanded. There were more and more candidates, which put pressure on the society, which needed extra funding. Clearly defined gardeners' roles in the horticultural profession were a moving feast as the trade emerged from local production to a national trade with new manufactured products added to the offer, such as garden pots and machinery, garden buildings, and gardeners moved between commercial and domestic settings, so their networks expanded and changed. Forced by the expansion of different roles within the gardening trade over the 19th century, the pensions were allocated to a variety of different practicing gardeners, including but notwithstanding head gardeners, nurserymen, florists, grocers, fruiterers, bailiffs, seedsmen, garden writers, and importantly, widows and self-employed women, all these practitioners. So here, and I'm not going to dwell on these too long because I'm more interested in the pensioners, but here you can see various celebratory funds that were launched. Now, the International Horticultural Exhibition is an interesting one. In 1866, it saw a donation of £1,000 of its profits from the exhibition to go to the Gardeners Benevolent, much to the ire of the supporters of the Horticultural Society's Linley Library. And as friendly societies were notably patriotic, the Victoria era fund here, and this is a beautiful celebratory tribute to the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria in 1897. Although a little slow to the cause, the Good Samaritan Fund in 1899 was set up to give temporary aid to gardeners who were in urgent need. So a boost, and this is on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see these auxiliaries appearing. And really from 1893 onwards, this was the main fundraising element of the charity, incredibly important. And they've appeared as a force to be reckoned with in the latter part of the century. Usually structured with a head gardener of a significant estate playing the chair and the sort of patron of them, a local committee of supporters, and they actively lobbied for their local pension candidates in the election, and they fundraised like mad. The Reading Auxiliary, which was set up here in 1898, was supported by the Sutton family of Sutton Seeds, and they were already considering implementing a company pension anyway. Charitable gardeners with extra skills held fundraising musical concerts, chrysanthemum societies held fêtes, ladies ran charitable flower arranging classes, and the more famous head gardeners who had reached almost celebrity status by now in the gardening press and at the Horticultural Society shows died leaving generous legacies from the society. And one of the most significant, or one of the significant Gardeners Benevolent fundraising activities were garden openings, which you can see listed at the bottom here. So this rather wobbly gentleman held up by his flower stand, I think he might fall over if he didn't hang on to it. He's called John Perkins. And head gardeners and nurserymen were seen as fraternal recruiters for the society, rather like Freemasons. John was a prominent head gardener and a subscriber to the Gardeners Benevolent since 1851, when it obtained its royal status. He had published Floral Designs for the Table in 1877, which is a wonderful book at the British Library, and it takes you back to that Victorians entertaining on a huge scale with enormous tables and fantastic decorations. Absolutely gorgeous book. Do go and have a look at it. He was tasked by his employer, Lord Henniker, to prepare the gardens at the Thornham estate, and this is the Thornham estate here on the left. It's a rather black and white photo, but you can see the scale of it. And he was asked to prepare the gardens to open in aid of the society in September 1882. The Ipswich Chronicle reported, "In this matter, Mr. Perkins did not let the grass grow under his feet." So what happened? Here's another picture of the gardens, and you can see the wonderful Victorian bedding, the glass houses here. Now, as this is a garden history talk, and I know everybody is waiting for a garden plan, so I have put a garden plan in because I know you all want to see one. And this is a garden plan of Thornham. This is the house. This is this bit here, along here. This is the wonderful kitchen garden here. Great big space, a bit of a wilderness and a lake. And you can see that it's quite a substantial garden with substantial grounds. So Henniker was a landowner, an MP, a philanthropist, a Grand Master of a Freemason lodge, and High Sheriff of Suffolk. And he was happy to show his largesse, although he didn't attend. He had also completed a transformation of his house at great expense with designs by the fashionable Sidney Smirke. So it's not clear whether John Perkins persuaded his employer to allow a fete to take place, but charitable fetes and bazaars in aid of local causes were a regular occurrence at Thornham. So there was a sort of precedent to being able to do it. And there was a movement to get the pension raised from £16 to £20 by subscribers. And this would have seemed a charitable goal. And this was the first garden opening in aid of the Gardeners Benevolent, to much fanfare with entertainment, stalls, and a brass band planned for the Tuesday. However, it was a British event, so it rained and it was postponed until the Thursday, which I have to say, a much reduced amateur dramatic performance by the Ipswich Philo-Thespian Society was carried out. The deplorable circumstances of weather reduced the event and the funds to raising a paltry £40 after costs of £75. But Perkins was congratulated on his sterling efforts anyway, and rendered blind in old age, he was allocated a Gardeners Benevolent pension in 1898. and many more historic gardens would follow this example and open to raise the funds for the Friendly Society. So our pensioners were being rewarded for their loyalty to the Friendly Society, but there were competing benefit and Friendly Societies out there and associations within the time limit. I'm going to briefly cover three. The United Horticultural Benevolent and Providence Society was an offshoot of the United Horticultural Society, led by Shirley Hibbard, the amateur gardening expert and garden writer. Established in 1865, it appealed to the sympathy of a body of intelligent men who had contributed so materially to the delight of the eye and the delicacies of the table. It had a wonderful banner called "Union is Strength," and you can see that on the left here, and which to a modern ear sounds almost like a trade union. It encouraged every gardener to join the above society for assistance to gardeners in time of sickness and old age. And its four key selling points were: firstly, its absolute safety and undoubtable stability. So it was a safe financial investment. Two, the comprehensiveness of the rules that govern its working. And we know gardeners like rules. Three, the advantages it offers over all other general benefit societies. I think that's a case of trust me, I'm a gardener. And four, its convalescence fund, which actually was the most important thing and was taken up by many gardeners. So for an annual subscription, it held flower shows here at the Green Dragon in Bishopsgate, now long gone, unfortunately, it's not there at all. And a paper was often read by key nurserymen and prizes were given out. Hibbard knew how to attract gardeners. He, George Baker and Joseph Newton as honorary secretaries, and William Marshall of Enfield was a great supporter, and it lasted well into the 20th century. So the Gardeners Royal Orphan Fund, which I'll briefly look at, was established in 1887, and it was another charitable organisation that aimed to support families of gardeners. William Barron was its main advocate and organiser, and again, time precludes me from going into its details, and it's more on the charitable side of these associations, but it celebrated its achievements with dinners and gifts to families and children in need. And finally, what my third year of research is going to be touching on is the British Gardeners Association, established in 1904. Now, this was not a union as such, but certainly went some way to nationally represent gardeners and their employment conditions. William Henry Divers, head gardener at Belvoir Castle, I think I'm probably not pronounced that correctly, but he wrote a letter to the Gardeners Chronicle to call a meeting due to the confused state into which the disorganised gardening profession is drifting, he declared. He wasn't looking to introduce trade unionism, but remarked that other trades had united in some way. Interestingly, he did not see it as the responsibility of the RHS, which had far too many other subjects claiming its attention, he said. So we must set bravely to work and help ourselves. By 1906, many gardeners had actually joined, and many head gardeners, including as secretary John Weathers, the former assistant secretary of the RHS, nurseryman Cutbush of Highgate, journalist Charles Curtis, and Walter P. Wright, editor of The Gardener. And some Kew staff joined as well, including William Watson and lots of park superintendents. William Pettigrew, superintendent of Cardiff Parks, got the local council to recognise the British Gardeners Association certificate and to increase wages of his staff. In May 1907, the Popular Journal appeared and was later named the British Gardener, and it was published until the war. However, membership could result in immediate termination of employment, with rumblings of Bolshevism echoing around many historic gardens and estates. So William Crump of Harold Weald sacked his gardener the minute he heard he had joined the BGA. The BGA respectfully responded that Sir William has overstepped the bounds which employers should observe if they wish to be intelligently and loyally served. George Glennie would have been so proud, and perhaps the gardeners had finally broken the glass ceiling and were mobilising at last. Thank you very much. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Francesca. That was really, I particularly enjoyed the idea that John Perkins, the gardener, didn't let the grass grow. No, it was a really good survey for a group of people who are quite often, usually without any identity or mention, written out of history. If anybody's got a question, this would be a good time to put one in the chat box. Somebody has already, which I'm pleased to see.
Brilliant.
But I wonder if I might ask you if your work is has the potential to be a route to giving names and personalities to those people who were at the bottom and would have been written out of history had this pension system not been in place. So we could find out who somebody was and where they worked and where they moved because they were in receipt or applying for pensions from these various organisations.
Yes, because I started my PhD in lockdown, so access to archival material is quite limited, but the Gardeners Chronicle is obviously online at Biodiversity Library, which is brilliant. And I spent the whole of lockdown slowly going through it, taking all the data and putting it into a rather large spreadsheet. I have a very large spreadsheet of all the candidates and all the people who actually got paid pensions, how many times they appealed. And then I looked in the census, so Find My Past and Ancestry, I have a subscription to those, and I matched them with that. So I've got a lot of data now, and my sort of next stage with those individuals is to match them and get some case studies, really, rather like I've sort of mentioned a few here, of individuals and where they worked, and then trying to track them around the country or see who that, because you can see their obituaries in the end, so you can see where they end. Obituaries are jolly useful for telling people what happened to them. So absolutely, there is a massive resource sitting there, potential to track these amazing professionals who really created the industry.
Yeah, that's really good. Stephen Green has pointed out that Belvoir, which is in Rutland, it is pronounced rather in an unlikely way as beaver.
Yes, I knew I hadn't got it right. I was thinking, oh my gosh, somebody must know, because I know it's got a very odd spelling. Yes.
One of those English words that sounds nothing like the way it's spelt. Louise has said it's a brilliant paper, Francesca, and such an interesting insight into the lives of nurserymen later in their lives. You think there was a greater bond between nurserymen of specific regions or between distinct industries?
That's very interesting, because there was so much overlap. You get market gardeners who are selling florist flowers, you get nurserymen selling cabbages, but I think regionality was very, very important, and certainly in the Gardeners Benevolent, for example, the gardeners around Bristol and that whole kind of powerhouse of production of plants, and they really supported their candidates and stuck together. And it wasn't a surprise that then there was an auxiliary that came from that, really, because they were quite a powerful group and quite vocal, particularly in the gardening press, and stood up for themselves as a group. And obviously there was a lot of local mutual aid going on around that as well, and people being employed locally.
So you think that place was more important than sort of sub-trade?
Yes, I think so. I think people did move. I mean, obviously people moved as part of their apprenticeship. They moved, they'd get for example, Rivers of Sawbridgeworth, their staff went and worked in Veitches, and then they came back again and implemented skills on displaying plants, because Veitches were good at that. So there were definitely professional, there was also obviously links in terms of skills, but I think the regions were very important.
Yeah. Pippa is asking, could you say a little bit more about the treatment of women gardeners?
Yes, I mean, certainly towards the end of the century, what you see, and my spreadsheet is lovely for, is you can see that there are independent women who have either inherited their businesses from their husbands, and I think I think Malcolm Thick and certainly Richard Capewell will probably back me up on this. You know, the Worshipful Company was interested in women inheriting businesses. So you get individual women who have got their own business, either it's a nursery business or a florist business, and they in their own right subscribe to the society. And then after 15 years, they automatically get their pension. So they are financially planning themselves, and they might well be all on their own, but they are running a business themselves. And I've got various cases of that, which are fascinating because they are holding it together, you know, in a man's world, really.
Yeah. Ailsa said, thank you for a great and informative talk. What are the major sources for the research? Where have you been going? You mentioned the Gardeners Chronicle.
Yes, I mean, the Gardeners Chronicle is excellent. The Gardeners Gazette by Glennie is a great read. Unfortunately, that isn't online. That is in the British Library, and I urge everybody to read it because it is just, you know, it's before the Gardeners Chronicle, and it's a great read, very local, very kind of, he writes in a very funny way. I think I find him quite funny because he's so frank about things and argumentative and, you know, difficult. But yeah, apart and his other writings too are excellent. And then there are various, the Floricultural magazines. Floricultural magazine is a good one. The Florist is another one. There's a very good list that actually Anne Wilkinson put together as part of her PhD of publications, and I know the RHS has their list as well of publications of the 19th century, and it's worth finding Anne Wilkinson's PhD and then looking at that list and then asking the RHS to send you their list, because then you've got to love that they're dated, because a lot of them only lasted a little time because they flopped. So you can track them and you can find them online, or then, you know, book in to go and read them at various archives. So there is a lot of stuff out there to read without even going to the estates and, you know, reading any archival documents from them.
Yeah. L. Jones saying, fascinating, thank you. What became of the Royal Zoological Gardens in Surrey?
Yes, they were quite connected to the shows, really, and they kind of fizzled out. There is an article in the Journal of the RHS, which is a good article to read. I can send a link later if anybody wants to get in touch. Please do. My email was on the last page, but I can put it in the chat, and you can find me on Queen Mary's list. But yeah, they fizzled out, I think, mainly because, rather like all the pleasure gardens, people found something else to do, kind of thing. So I think they fizzled out by the 1840s, and the shows fizzled out too, because, you know, the horticultural shows really took over and sort of were the main kind of push for competitions.
Yeah. There are two separate questions here. And this interests me as well, not being based in London. Richard Capewell, have you found whether the GBI pensioners were disproportionately in a particular region, or were they evenly spread across the UK? And Gillian has asked, also thanking for the paper, you've concentrated mostly on London and the South East. How far north did the benevolent organisations reach?
Yeah, so there are Carlisle and Kendal. There's a nurseryman called John Greer, whose family had dumped him in the workhouse, which I thought was a bit mean. And he is appealing for a pension because I think the family just want him sort of sorted. So yes, there's a little pocket up there in Kendal. And then there's lots in the west of England. As the century goes through, you get more in sort of Nottingham, and you get some in Norfolk, and you get a lot in Kent and Surrey and Sussex and that sort of area. But and Scotland is sort of considered as a separate area. You don't get much going on in Scotland. You get Scottish gardeners who have come down south, but not many people actually living in Edinburgh or the big conurbations there, or the big estates. So it is quite regionally based, specific regionally based. And I've actually done a Google map, because on Google Maps you can map. You can put in lots of data, a CVS file, and then it will show you a map of all of them. And I haven't got that to show today, but it is quite interesting looking at where they are. Obviously, they shift a bit sometimes. They do move between properties, or they just literally stay the same place a mile from, you know, the estate that they were born on. It's very interesting, that pattern too.
Yeah, that's what my forebears did, who were gardeners. Louisa, you've asked about any mention of women gardeners, and we've covered that a little bit with Pippa's question. If there's anything you'd like to ask specifically, could you put it on the chat? She's asked any mention of women gardeners, and is there anything more you'd like to add to that, Francesca?
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
go on.
I mean, the women. If you think about the festival dinners at the London, at the Crown and Anchor Tavern, and then they moved to what is now the Corinthia Hotel, which is rather swanky in London, but it was called the Metropole Hotel. They moved sort of west, so they sort of in the middle of the century. The women were allowed in the gallery; they weren't allowed to sit with everybody else. So, you know, obviously, we kind of have this impression of 19th century women being fairly suppressed, and they were. But there were practitioners and some, you know, female practitioners who did seek pensions from the Gardeners Benevolent, but they may well have sought other sources of association too. But I haven't yet to look into them as you know, in detail yet.
So you don't have a sense of whether they were more, less, or equally successful as the men in obtaining pensions?
Well, certainly the widows were extremely successful. I mean, they by the end of the century, you know, the widows take up a large chunk of the cash. So, you know, because they outlived the men. So they were left, you know, they might outlive their, again, on my spreadsheet, I can see that women are outliving men, you know, by 20, 30 years, and they're still getting a pension. So it's costing the society a lot of money to keep these wives going, but they are respected as being a key part of the gardener's life. And therefore they are, as a friendly society, it respects the fact that, you know, the wife should get a pension. It's a smaller pension, but it is a pension.
Yeah. There are three more questions at the moment, although the next two come from the same person. Were the pensions one-off payments, or were they awarded annually? And what happened to the many who petitioned for a pension but weren't awarded one, despite having made regular payments over a period?
Well, so I've got so they were annual payments. You had to wait a bit before you got your pension, which often people died. So they might get allocated pension. To start with, there were 2 elections biannual, and then there became 1 for funding reasons. But sometimes people died, so they actually didn't ever get their pension. But their family write to the society and say, could we please have the burial fees? And you've got multiple letters of families going, oh, could we have the burial fees, please? Can we have the £4? Because the £4 would help very much to, you know, bury him. And then, you know, you get yes, that's no problem, here you are, you can have £4, or actually we quite liked him, so you can have 5. And then the people that apply and don't get, and there are many people, and they stop publishing how many times people had applied and didn't get it, because I think it was starting to get a bit embarrassing, because they didn't have enough pension money to give the pension. So, you know, people would be, I mean, poor Edward Marshall 13 times and finally got one. So what I can see is, so for example, there's a chap called William Jackson, William Jackson, and he was also a mason. So he worked in Chelsea, just off Sloane Street, in one of the nurseries there, which were all nurseries in 1854. And he was a mason. He joined various masons' lodges, and you can see him paying his subscription to that. And then when he doesn't get a pension from the Gardeners Benevolent, he goes to the masons, and the masons give him a pension in 1862. So he transfers. They're resourceful. They know, if I'm not going to get one there, I'm going to try and get one over there. And they have put their guinea in to, you know, various places and spread their bet so that they can look after themselves. And he does get one from, and the Museum of Freemasonry. Again, I'd recommend anybody interested in this sort of people side of gardening, go and have a look at their books, because it is an amazing library. It's fascinating, and they have got some wonderful documents there too. And gardeners appear. You know, and the Hortus Lodge is a great story. That again, end of the century, key players in the gardening trade set up a trade called the Hortus Lodge. They set up a lodge called the Hortus Lodge.
Yeah. Michelle, thanks you for your fascinating paper. Could you give the title of the table book that you mentioned at the British Library, because she really has to see
Yeah.
it?
Perkins, yes, Perkins. It's called Floral Designs for the Table. And it is a beautiful book, and it has they had a cricket team there, and so one of his designs is says welcome on it in floral decorations, and it was in the colours. They were called the Zingilla team for some reason, and they were all Etonians and Harrovians, and they had a certain colour, purple, I think a purple and gold and white sort of kit that they wore, and the table decoration matched their kit, of course.
Yeah. Two more comments and questions about regional matters. If some of the regions, Gillian asks, were not making or supporting claims to the benevolent institutions, does that mean that they were simply not engaged in the networks, or that their gardeners were better provided for?
Well, that is a really good question, and I know, Gillian, you're looking at the back houses. So yes, I think there is certainly, there's a wonderful history of Cheel's nursery in Crawley, and I'm sorry, that's not, I know it's south, but it's just a good example that was written by one of the granddaughters, I think, of the family, a Quaker family, and because they were Quaker, they obviously looked after their staff, and they take them on trips. They have they look after them in housing, and they really look after their teams and make sure that they're well trained. They've got they're looked after in old age, and there's a real sense of community around the nursery. And I think that's something that I don't really touch on because I'm looking at sort of associations, but it's a very important key bit of the nursery trade, and vitally important and wonderful if somebody can, look at that, because it is local history. It's vibrant local history, but it's also relevant on a national scale.
Yeah. And Malcolm Thick is saying that there was some antagonism towards Scottish gardeners in England in the early 19th century. Were they able to join the societies without hindrance and obtain pensions?
Yes. Well, so as we know, the Worshipful Company actually took a writ out against the Scottish gardeners. I think it was Lee, wasn't it, and Kennedy and people like that, Malcolm, who were doing rather well in the 1790s, and the Worshipful Company didn't like it because obviously they were all over in West London in the neat gardens that you've written a wonderful book about, Malcolm, and they didn't like it at all that the Scots gardens were rather good. And there is a very good paper too about how people really did like Scottish gardeners. They had a really good reputation and people wanted to hire them. And Archibald MacNaughton, his brilliant piece that he wrote about being a Scottish gardener, he acknowledges that people were like to employ Scottish gardeners because they were seen to be good. But yes, there was a resistance, and the Worshipful Company obviously didn't like it at all. So, but I don't believe they actually succeeded in stopping them. And I know David Marsh's paper had some explanation about how that case kind of went on, and actually Scottish gardeners, as we know, just carried on.
And finally, I think Stephen Green is asking, could you repeat the details of the PhD? That's the Anne Wilkinson one, which I think you mentioned.
Yes, yes, I can. It's now it is. I think it's. She is a two-handed. She did two parts to it, and if you Google Anne Wilkinson PhD, and she did it at the Open University, so that will help find it. And the second half of it is about the gardening press, and she's just put this brilliant list with the key players and the lists of the publications and when they ran from and what they were about.
It's online under the E3.
Yes, it is online. If you look at the Open University, if you Google Open University Anne Wilkinson, you will get her Shirley Hibbard book, which is also an excellent read. And also her pieces about the chrysanthemum societies in the East End of London, which again are brilliant. There we go. That's it. That's the yes, I can see he's got the link. Yeah, yes. It's great.
Good. Thank you very much. I'll hand us back to Michael Lunn.
Sorry. Michael Lunn unfortunately has lost her picture, so she's asked me to Thank you so much, Francesca. It's an extraordinary depth of research and about real people, which we don't always have, I think.